I am Ranvald, High Priest of Gamla Uppsala, the ancient seat of the gods' worship in the heart of the Swedish lands. We are at the center of what was once the holiest kingdom, where offerings of men, horses, and gold are made in the name of Thor, Freyr, and above all, Odin. Here, in the core of this frozen world, stood the Great Hall, and the burial mounds of ancient kings who ruled with wisdom and brutality. It was the late 9th century, and the village was quiet, a silence that chilled my soul. The great block festival, when human and animal sacrifices were offered, was approaching. I had spent years in this position, overseeing these ceremonies, watching executions with the coldness my title required. But this year, something was weird. The first night began like any other, with merchants crowding the markets around the temple. Wolf and bear pelts filled the stalls, while weapons and cult objects were sold to visitors from far and wide, from small villages or even distant cities like Burka. The torches lit the path between the market and the grove where the sacrifices would take place, yet a growing unease filled my chest. We had captured Saxon prisoners for the ritual. Their lives would be given to Odin, the Allfather. But as Thor's hammer crushed the skull of the first, something changed in the air. I felt the presence of an ancient force. A chill ran down my spine, the kind no winter could bring. It was as if the ground itself trembled, a deep vibration echoing from the land of the dead. I gazed toward the sacred grove, where ancient trees bent, appearing like dark, distorted shadows. The wind carried whispers, ancient murmurs, as if the gods were warning me of something. On the second night, the signs became clearer. The oxen meant for sacrifice were found dead by morning, their eyes gouged out and bodies swollen as if poisoned by something not of this world. Men from the village began having visions. They spoke of ghostly figures at the forest edge, cloaked shapes that didn't belong to the gods we knew. My hands trembled as I lit the torches around the hall. I, who had never feared death or rituals, felt a fear I had never known. It was as if an invisible veil between our world and the realm of the dead was disintegrating. The village elder, a wise man, approached me with terror in his eyes. He spoke of an ancient spirit known as Draugr, a cursed being that returns from the grave. On the third day, something terrible happened. The moon hung high, and the darkness of the forest surrounding the village seemed deeper, older. I was alone in the temple, preparing the final sacrifice, when I heard heavy footsteps. The empty hall echoed, and for a moment I thought it was one of the warriors. But when I turned, I saw a figure that should not have been there. It was a man, tall and hooded. His clothes were in tatters, as if they had rotted over centuries. His eyes glowed with a spectral blue light, and his face was partially decayed, marked by decomposition. The stench of death clung to him, like the odor of corpses left in the sun for many days. I knew then he was not human. "The sacrifice will not suffice," he whispered, his voice like a cutting wind. "You have broken the pact." My heart froze. There was no pact I knew of, but the elders' tales echoed in my mind. Stories of forgotten agreements between dead kings and the gods, of sacrifices that should never have been stopped. The Draugr was there to collect his debt. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My knees buckled, and he stepped forward, his bony hand reaching for my chest. I felt an icy grip, as if my heart was being crushed. I tried to invoke Odin, Thor, any god who could save me, but their voices were distant, as if they had abandoned me. The temple fell into absolute silence, except for the sound of my labored breathing. When I thought I would meet my end there alone, an invisible force threw me backward. The Draugr vanished, but I knew I wasn't safe. What he said, that pact, something ancient had been broken. On the final night, I knew it would be my turn. Men began to disappear. First the prisoners, then the villagers themselves. The children screamed at night, saying they saw figures lurking in the shadows of their homes. And when I tried to flee, the forest seemed to close around me, like a living trap. The temple now stood empty, save for me and the dead. And I knew my time had come. The torches extinguished one by one, and the silence returned. I felt the cold once more, and this time it would not leave. The Draugr was behind me. This time he would not let me escape. I felt his hand on my shoulder, and the world collapsed. But there was no pain. I opened my eyes and realized I was no longer in the temple. I was in the middle of the forest, standing before an ancient tree. At my feet, an open grave. And inside it, me. I understood at that moment. I had been dead for far longer than I could have imagined. Now, I am only a shadow, like so many others who walk through Uppsala, aimless. The sacrifice never ends.
I still recall that dreadful night. It was the year of our Lord 1191, and I was marching alongside my brothers in arms through the Levant. We had taken Jaffa, and from there, our orders were to push further inland. The moon hung low, a sickly crescent, barely illuminating the vast expanse of sand and stone that stretched before us. We were weary, drained by battles and plagued by the haunting memories of those we'd sent into the abyss. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The whispers began that night. Faint, like a lover's breath against one's ear, but colder. Oh, so much colder. At first, I thought it was the wind teasing us, but then I realized they were words. Words in a language that none of us knew, yet somehow, we all understood. "We must press on," declared Sir Baldwin, our leader, his eyes aflame with a zeal I had never seen before. He claimed that a relic of unimaginable power lay hidden in the ruins of the ancient city of Ubar, a city that the sands had swallowed long ago. A city that, according to local tales, was cursed. Erem of the Pillars, they called it. I wish I had ignored his command, but how could I? I was a crusader, bound by oath, and Baldwin's conviction was infectious. We ventured deeper into the desert, and with every step, those whispers grew louder, more insistent. After hours of wandering, we saw them, pillars tall and skeletal, jutting out of the sand like fingers of a giant buried alive. It was Airal. The city had not been a myth after all. The ground trembled as we entered, and suddenly the air grew still, unnaturally so. Not even the wind dared disturb this place. "Do you hear that?" whispered Geoffrey, the youngest among us, his eyes wide with terror. I strained my ears, but there was nothing, not even the faintest breeze. It's like the world is holding its breath. Baldwin, however, was undeterred. He marched forward, his sword raised high, and we followed, though every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn back. It wasn't long before we found it, an ancient temple, half buried in the sand, its entrance flanked by two enormous statues. Their eyes, though carved from stone, seemed to watch us with a knowing malice. "We claim this in the name of God," Baldwin proclaimed, stepping inside. But God was not with us that night. The moment we crossed the threshold, the air turned heavy, almost suffocating. And then we saw them, shadows writhing on the walls, yet there was no source of light to cast them. They moved with purpose, whispering in that same unholy language, and I swear to you, their voices grew louder each time one of us took a breath. Baldwin pressed on, undeterred, until we reached a large chamber. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it lay a dagger, its blade black as obsidian and pulsating with an eerie glow. The relic. Baldwin's eyes gleamed with madness as he reached out to seize it. "No," I shouted, but it was too late. The moment his fingers touched the hilt, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The shadows swirled around Baldwin, and oh, how they laughed. He dropped to his knees, his face twisted in agony, and before we could reach him, something happened. Something I still can't fully grasp. His body began to wither, aging in seconds, his flesh turning to dust before my very eyes. We watched, frozen in horror, as he crumbled, leaving nothing but his armor behind. And that's when we realized the shadows were no mere illusions. They were the souls of those who had sought the relic before us, trapped for all eternity. "Run!" Geoffrey screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows lunged, and one by one, my brothers fell, their cries echoing in the chamber. I turned to flee, but then I saw it, my reflection, twisted and distorted, staring back at me from the blade of the dagger. And in that moment, I understood. I would never leave this place. Yet somehow I did. I woke up outside the temple, the morning sun beating down on my face, the taste of sand in my mouth. I stumbled to my feet and found myself alone. The city, the shadows, the whispers, gone. It was as if they had never existed. But Baldwin's armor remained, half buried in the sand, the dagger still clutched in his skeletal hand. I ran, abandoning my oath, my brothers, everything. I thought I was free, but I was wrong. Years have passed, and I've done everything to forget. I returned to England, hung up my sword, and tried to rebuild a life that no longer felt like mine. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed. They started faint, barely a murmur, but with each passing night, they grew stronger, and their message became clearer. Then, one evening, as I sat by the hearth, I saw it, the dagger. It lay there, resting on the mantel, though I had never brought it with me. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. And that's when I heard it, distinct and unmistakable. Baldwin's voice calling my name. I reached out, trembling, unable to resist. The moment my fingers touched the blade, everything went black. I found myself back in Iram, standing in that forsaken chamber, my brother's shadows staring at me from the walls. But this time I understood. I looked down and saw my reflection in the blade. It wasn't my face staring back. It was Baldwin's. He smiled, and then I knew. I was never meant to escape. None of us were. The curse wasn't a place. It was a cycle, binding us together, forever trapped. And now it's my turn to wait for the next fool who will come, seeking what should never be found.
I arrived at the monastery of São Miguel in the harsh winter of 1348. I was summoned by the Holy Inquisition to investigate a mystery that had already claimed the lives of 4 monks under inexplicable circumstances. The violence of their deaths and the silence surrounding them were disturbing. Something was deeply wrong in that place. As I passed through the rusted iron gates, I felt the weight of the cold air, as if the very earth carried a dark secret. The monastery was an imposing structure, its stone walls worn down by centuries, and its towers rising against the leaden sky. But it was in the silence and the gloom of its interior that the real terror seemed to hide. I was greeted by the abbot, an aged and taciturn man, whose eyes carried the burden of a fear he dared not name. He led me through the courtyard to the central church, where a sacred relic had recently been rediscovered after centuries of being forgotten. An ancient cross, worn by time, yet still bearing dark stains that the monks claimed were blood. This relic, buried in a crypt beneath the altar, had been exhumed after a monk claimed to have received a vision during prayer, showing him where it was hidden. It was at that moment that the horrors began. Every monk who had touched or prayed near the cross had died a horrific death. First, their bodies became feverish, their eyes turned mad, and then came endless screams that echoed throughout the abbey until their final moments of agony. I decided to investigate, but something about the cross deeply unsettled me. There was a metallic smell in the air, as if the very blood had soaked into the space. I felt a chill, and I noticed that the dark stains on the wood seemed fresh, as though the blood continued to slowly seep from an ancient, still open wound. That night, I dreamed of the cross. In my dream, it was not an inert object, but a living presence, breathing, pulsating with a malevolent energy. I saw shadows moving around it, human figures distorted by pain and despair. I awoke drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing, feeling the icy touch of death close by. The next day, I discovered that one of the younger monks had disappeared. His quarters were ransacked, the bed soaked with sweat, and the only clue was a trail of wet footprints leading toward the crypt beneath the church. With a heavy heart, I descended into the depths of the crypt. Each step echoed like a muffled scream. When I reached the bottom, I saw something that froze my blood. The young monk was kneeling before the cross, but his body was immobile, rigid like a statue. As I approached, I realized his eyes were wide open, staring into the void as if he had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. Blood dripped from his mouth, as though something inside him had been corrupted to its very core. It was then that I felt it. The cross was watching me. The weight of the cursed boar struck me with full force. The relic was no sacred blessing, but a trap. It was a remnant of a long-forgotten pagan ritual, a blood offering that should never have been unearthed. Each monk who succumbed to madness and death was merely another sacrifice to feed the cross, to keep it alive. I knew I had to destroy it. I couldn't let more souls be taken. But as I tried to approach, the atmosphere changed. The air around the cross grew dense, difficult to breathe, and the space around me seemed to shrink. I began to hear whispers, ancient voices, mingled in a cacophony of indistinct sounds that pressed upon me from all directions. They called me by name. In a desperate act, I pulled the young monk away from the cross, dragging his lifeless body to the entrance of the crypt. But the shadows, they were there. I saw distorted forms moving along the walls, grotesque caricatures of human beings, presences that could never be explained by words or faith. Something beyond my understanding had been awakened, and now it pursued those who dared to challenge it. I fled the crypt, sealing the entrance with boards and chains. I begged the abbot to burn the cross, but he refused, claiming it was a sacred relic, that it would protect us. There were no more deaths in the days that followed, but the evil remained. I felt the presence of the cross in my dreams, calling me back, pulling me into that infernal abyss where no soul should tread. When I left the monastery, I carried with me a terrible certainty. That cross was not proof of divinity, but of something much older and more malevolent. A remnant of a time when blood fed forgotten gods, and now it was waking again, waiting for its next victim. Even after all these years, I still hear the whispers in the darkness, and every time I close my eyes, I see the cross, always waiting, and I know that one day it will find me again.
I remember the smell of freshly baked bread that morning, wafting from the bakery. The warm air was still pleasant, and the sound of the marketplace was beginning to come alive, with a murmur of familiar voices filling the streets of Pompeii. I was selling spices. I had just opened my small shop on Via dell'Abbondanza, one of the busiest streets in the city. Birds chirped around the temple of Apollo, and horses clattered their hooves on the worn stones, restless as their owners haggled over fresh fruit and goods. Everything seemed normal, but the animals, something about them was wrong. The dogs were restless, pacing in circles and barking at nothing. I saw some of them howling, as if sensing something terrible in the air. On the horizon, beyond the temples and marble statues, Mount Vesuvius stood still, silent as ever, but a thin plume of smoke began to rise slowly from the crater. No one paid attention. Vesuvius, our old neighbor, was a sleeping guardian, and we Pompeians never truly worry about him. But shortly after midday, the air began to change. Something suffocating and dense hung over the streets. I first felt a chill crawl up my spine, a feeling I couldn't explain. Then, there was a roar, like the sound of 1,000 thunderstorms at once, but distant, deep. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The noise grew louder, reverberating between the buildings and echoing through the hills. I ran to the main square, the confusion rising around me. The Forum, which minutes before was a center of trade and life, turned into a place of confusion and fear. People began spilling out of their homes, looking up at the sky. Vesuvius, the giant, had finally awoken. The sky, once blue, began to darken. Ash started to fall like a storm. I looked around and saw nothing but terrified faces, all with the same question in their eyes. What was happening? Within minutes, chaos erupted. Some screamed for us to flee to the port. Others clung to their statues of gods and goddesses as if begging for divine protection. I started running. My feet pounded against the hot stones as the ground continued to shake violently. Bodies piled up in the narrow streets as everyone tried to escape at once, shooting each other in desperation. I remembered my wife, Lucilla, and our children. They were home far from the market, but I couldn't turn back. The way was blocked by the desperate crowd. I saw faces I knew, friends who shopped at my store, other merchants. One of them, Marco, a fabric seller, was trampled in front of me as he tried to get up. I wanted to help him, but I was pushed forward by the frantic mass. Screams and cries filled the air. Vesuvius kept roaring, now louder and closer, as if hell itself was opening. The ash was falling thicker. My eyes burned, my throat felt like it was on fire. The heat was unbearable, and the stench of sulfur and death mixed with the smell of burning bodies. Houses crumbled around us. The city was dissolving under the weight of destruction. The horses, once elegantly pulling carriages, had gone mad. They charged through the streets, knocking down anyone in their way, their eyes wild with panic. Birds fell from the sky, suffocated by the smoke. Dogs howled in agony, their fur covered in scorching ash. I could hear the crackling of fires starting to consume the city. I desperately tried to find shelter, but there was nowhere safe. Stones rained from the sky, large and heavy, smashing roofs and skulls alike. I ran toward the Temple of Jupiter, a grand structure that had once seemed untouchable in the center of the square. Thought the gods might protect me there, but even the temple began to crumble, its giant columns collapsing like toys before the fury of the mountain. I found a small group of people huddled in a corner, trying to shield themselves from the heat. Their eyes were empty, as if they had already accepted the end. But I couldn't. I couldn't just wait for death. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept running. I didn't know where to go, I just ran. Every step was harder than the last. The ash covered me like a shroud of death, suffocating, weighing me down. Finally, my strength left me, fell to my knees on the rough, hot ground, and it was then that I realized there was no escape. The sky was as dark as night, though it was still afternoon, and on the horizon, the wave of fire and molten rock was descending quickly, consuming everything in its path. I couldn't stand anymore. All I could do was look around one last time, my vision blurred by smoke and pain. Pompeii, my home, my life, was disappearing, sinking beneath an eternal shroud of ash. Everything I had ever known and loved was being destroyed before my eyes. The last thing I felt was the suffocating heat enveloping me, and everything went dark like a candle blown out by a cruel wind.
That day began like any other. I had no idea that by the end of it, the world as we knew it would no longer exist. The chaos didn't creep in slowly. There were no signs, or at least none that I noticed. It all happened abruptly, like thunder without lightning, a shadow without light. It was a stifling morning. The sky over Buenos Aires was gray, heavy, and the warm wind carried with it a strange sense of foreboding. But I ignored it. Work downtown awaited, and, as usual, I walked through the streets of San Telmo, passing by the market where vendors were already in place, pushing fresh fruits and meat under tattered awnings. The air smelled of perilla smoke and something else, something sour like sulfur. That morning, I wished I hadn't noticed. Everything changed around 11. I was having coffee on the corner of Avenida Belgrano when the wind stopped blowing. Completely still. Silence fell over the city like a thick veil, muffling even the sound of cars. People froze, as if some primal instinct had been triggered. It was as if everyone, somehow, knew something terrible was about to happen. I remember looking up at the sky, and that's when I saw it. The sun split. There was no eclipse, no cloud. Just a dark tear ripping through the sky like a crack in a window pane. And from that black rift, something began to fall. The ancient prophecies of the Mapuche, the ones that spoke of Nagmapu, the shadow world that would open up to swallow the living, came to mind. I never believed in them. Who would? Old tales from ancient peoples meant to frighten children. But now suddenly, everything made sense. Every story, every warning I had dismissed. And that thing falling from the sky was not rain. It was shadows. Solid, alive, writhing like smoke taking form, devouring everything they touched. People tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows spread through the streets like an oil slick, moving with unnatural speed. I saw a man on the corner of Cal Defensa. A businessman in his expensive suit get swallowed by one of those things. He'd vanished in an instant, but what remained? What remained was an echo of him. Not gone, not alive, just a shadow of himself trapped between two worlds. My God, how many more would become that? Panic took over the city, but I stood still. My whole body fought against logic. Run, my mind screamed, but my legs, they wouldn't move. And then I heard something beyond the shadows, beyond the screams. A murmur, like an ancient prayer, sung in a language I didn't understand. Was this it then? The prophecy. That chant, always present in the air, as if the very earth was summoning it. A curse that had crossed time, forgotten until now. Finally, I was able to move. I ran for what felt like hours. The streets were deserted, except for the shadows, writhing, swallowing buildings, consuming the ground like a spreading cancer. I reached Parc Lazare. There was something strange there, a light, weak and pale, emanating from the old statue in the center. I approached cautiously, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it. Carved into the stone, in letters I couldn't understand, was the same prayer that echoed through the air. But before I could touch the statue, something pulled me back. A scream, sharp and wild, tore through the silence. A woman, or what looked like a woman, with eyes as empty as the abyss, was staring at me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She pointed at the sky, at the crack, and her skin began to dissolve into dust before my eyes. I ran again, but now with a weight in my chest. Whatever this was, there was no stopping it. The city was condemned, we all were. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath my feet, and I knew the collapse was imminent. Buildings around me crumbled as if made of sand. A new crack opened, this time in the very earth. The screams were inaudible now, drowned out by the endless murmur of that prayer, and I was thrown into the air, straight into the darkness. But I wasn't consumed. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a vast emptiness. I was back where it all started, on the corner by the cafe, looking up at the sky, where the sun no longer existed. The shadows were closer now, enveloping everything. And then, beside me, the woman. She whispered something in my ear, something I couldn't understand, but the fear gripped me. All of a sudden, everything stopped. The world hung in an unbearable stillness. In the last moment, I realized the prayer, the curse, it was never about the end of the world, but about what came after, and that after was already here. I turned toward the darkness.
My name is Nebo, son of a weaver, born in the shadows of the great walls of Babylon. I lived my life like any other common man in our grand city. I was not a warrior, nor a noble, just a plebeian, walking through the crowded streets, feeling the scorching heat of the Babylonian sun while performing the simple tasks of daily life. But what I witnessed during the fall of our city would forever change the way I understood the world of the living. That morning, the city seemed as alive as ever. Merchants sold their wares in the market, the air filled with the scent of spices and incense. I was walking towards the Isagila temple, where Marduk, the Almighty, reigned supreme, or so we believed. The hot wind subtly blew through the stone streets, and I felt an unease, a growing discomfort, as if the very air was heavy with dark omens. The rumors were inescapable. Cyrus the Great's army was near. The walls whispered stories of betrayal, of gates that would open from within. But no one believed that a city like Babylon, protected by Marduk, would fall so easily. No one except me. Something haunted me deeply, an invisible shadow I could not shake. Something was wrong with the world. Something was wrong with the gods. I continued my way to the market, trying to stifle these anxieties, but the unease grew like a weight in my chest. When I reached the main square, things began to change. The clouds that once merely hovered became thick, and the sky took on a bronze hue, as if the sun had been smothered by the gods. The people around me continued their lives, seemingly blind to what was happening. It was then that I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. The sound of the walls breaking echoed throughout the city like distant thunder. Cyrus was here. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air, and panic spread like a plague. The streets, once full of life, were now filled with people running in all directions, seeking a safe place. But there was no safety. I ran towards the Isagila temple, not out of faith, but because I felt something deeper was happening. When I arrived at the temple, the air was thick, almost tangible. The statues of gold and stone seemed distorted, and then I saw him, Marduk, not as a statue, but as a living presence, hovering above the temple, shrouded in shadows and golden light. He wasn't there to protect us. The face that had once been revered was now twisted in pure rage. The prayers that had echoed in my mind since childhood turned into empty hums. He was furious with us, his worshippers, but not because we had failed him. No, he was furious because we had forgotten what we truly were. Tools, nothing more than disposable pieces in a divine game. The ground began to open up around me, not with fire or destruction, but with a dark veil. The shadows rose from the cracks, dancing and taking shape, and it was then that I realized the true horror. Marduk wasn't just judging, he was sealing a curse over the city. In my mind, an ancient voice, cold as death, whispered, "You who have failed, who did not protect what was given to you, shall be the ghosts of the city, cursed to walk eternally through the ruins. Your souls will never rest. Your names will be erased from history as if you never existed." Then something unexpected happened. My skin began to burn, but it wasn't the usual heat of Babylon. It was as if some ancient energy was being poured into me, rooting itself inside my body. I looked at my hands and saw, horrified, that small marks began to appear, etched directly into my skin, symbols I couldn't recognize. They seemed to move, writhing like living serpents. I felt intense pain. It was as if something was trying to take control, as if I was being devoured from the inside out. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my hands touching the stone floor. The marks spread, crawling up my arms and chest. I tried to fight it, but it was useless. The energy filling me was not of life, but something much darker. I was being transformed, doomed to become an extension of Marduk's curse. Around me, the temple descended into chaos. The shadows that had emerged from the cracks now formed figures, grotesque and distorted, wandering through the temple, each marked with the same symbols now engraved on my skin. The statues of lesser gods split in half, as if something invisible was tearing them apart from within. I knew then what was happening. Marduk was trapping our souls, our lives, within ourselves. He would turn us into living shadows, condemned to wander the ruins forever, never finding peace, never escaping the cycle of suffering. In despair, I dragged myself to the temple entrance. I needed to leave to flee from this evil energy before it completely overtook me. But when I looked outside, the city was no longer the Babylon I knew. The streets were covered in a thick, almost supernatural fog, and indistinct shapes moved within it. Other citizens, condemned like me, deformed by the curse. I was no longer in Babylon. I was in a land between worlds, a place where time and space made no sense. What had started as a mere mortal conquest had now become a divine plan of destruction and eternal suffering. Cyrus the Great was just the instrument. The real power came from Marduk, and his wrath would now fall upon all of us. But there was something more. A deep sound, a rhythmic thumping that I could not ignore, came from the heart of the city. At first, I thought it was war drums, but then I realized the truth. They were heartbeats. The very city of Babylon was alive, pulsing with Marduk's dark energy. Each beat made the ground tremble, and I could feel the world around me unraveling, as if the city was about to collapse in on itself. With the last strength I had, I ran through the fog-covered streets, trying to escape this cycle of pain. But the city's heartbeats intensified, getting closer, louder, and I knew my time was running out. There was no escape. Marduk had sealed me in a fate of eternal suffering, along with all the others. Then I realized, we were not just victims, we were the sacrifice. The sacrifice so that the glory of Babylon would never be forgotten, but that we, its souls, would never rest. Each beat of the city's heart would echo for eternity, and our souls would continue to wander, trapped between this world and the next, never knowing peace, only the eternal reminder of a city that devoured us. And so, as I feel the shadows closing in on me, I hear the heartbeats getting louder, stronger, closer. I know what is coming. Soon, I too will join the pulse of the city, forever lost in the cursed ruins of Babylon.
My name is Chan, and I grew up in the rolling green hills of Gaul, among the oak forests and the murmurs of the Druids. It's the year 55 BC, the sky vast and imposing, and I am but a man living beneath its infinite mantle. Yet, there was something in the wind blowing across the fields these past few days, something that made the trees groan differently, as if they whispered forgotten secrets to those who dared listen. My village nestled at the foot of Mount Kovaimon, where the sanctuary of the great god Luger stood. They said only the chosen could hear his voice echo from the cliffs, but that night, during the Samhain festival, the whisper was clear, almost screaming. And it was I who heard it, as if an invisible hand had pulled me away from the circle of fire where everyone celebrated and danced. I moved through the forest that stretched towards the ancient temple. The leaves seemed to shimmer with a ghostly glow under the pale moonlight. My heart raced, and the air felt thicker, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. A dense mist wrapped around the trees, making the path ahead invisible. But I knew where I was going. It was as if something was guiding me, something ancient, dark, and hungry. The Temple of Lugus was made of stone, an old monument, older than the bones of the ancestors sleeping beneath the earth. And there I saw him, a man in a black hood, his back turned to me, whispering in a language I didn't understand, but that made the ground beneath my feet vibrate. His voice was cold and metallic, sharp like blades, and then he turned. The eyes. Oh, the eyes. They were empty sockets, burning with blue flames, and the mouth, with dried, cracked lips, twisted into a smile that shouldn't belong to anything living. You heard it, didn't you? He asked, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. I couldn't respond. It was as if my body was frozen, my blood turned to ice. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. He stepped forward, and I could smell burning flesh and rot, something that made my stomach churn. He spoke again. Luvis is dead, young Cian, and in his place, something older awakens, something that should never have been stirred. I don't know where I found the strength, but I managed to move, running back to the village. I could hear laughter that wasn't mine, that wasn't human. It echoed through the trees, following me, and even when I reached the edge of the forest, I knew I wasn't safe yet. The flame of the village bonfire seemed weaker, as if being snuffed out by an invisible hand. When I arrived, I realized everything was different. There was no more celebration, only silence. The hut stood empty, abandoned. I walked among them, calling out for my brothers, my friends, but only the wind answered, whispering my name as if mocking me. It repeated like a distorted echo. Then I heard it, a rhythmic metallic pounding coming from the center of the village. A dry, methodical sound like an axe chopping wood. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my ears, and found the druid Fionn kneeling before the great oak tree. In his hands he held a dagger stained with blood, and on his lips a chant that made the ground tremble. "They are coming, Cheyenne. They demand a sacrifice," he whispered without even looking at me, and the horror of his words hit me like a blow. I looked at the oak tree and saw, oh gods, I saw faces. Faces of people I knew, fused into the wood, twisting, screaming in agony. Their mouths opened, but there was no sound, only empty eyes staring at me, begging for something I couldn't give them. "What have you done to them?" I shouted, but my voice felt like it didn't belong to me. Fionn just smiled, that fragile, crooked smile he always had, and said to me, "They ask for more, Cheyenne. They always ask for more." And then everything went black. I woke up alone, in the middle of the forest, the smell of blood and wet earth still fresh in my nostrils. I ran back to the temple, seeking answers, but all I found was that hooded man waiting for me. "You can't run from this, Cheyenne," he said, and for the first time his voice was my own. "You can't escape the fate that awaits you." I fell to my knees, tears burning in my eyes, and reality twisted around me, warping like a nightmare from which there's no awakening. It was then that I realized the hooded man was me. It had always been me. I was the one who killed, who sacrificed, who whispered the forbidden words to awaken what should have remained asleep. The memories returned like blades slicing through my mind, and the pain was unbearable. "You condemned them, Cheyenne, and now you are part of this." The wind roared, carrying the man's laughter with it, my laughter, my curse. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. And now, as I write these last words, I know it's only the beginning. The village is empty, but I still hear the whispers, the screams, and the wind's taunt. And I know deep down that one day they'll come for me, because there is no escape, no salvation. In the end, that hooded man is always waiting. And now, I am the one who waits.
My name is Naram-Sin, and I am a soldier of Uruk. My city, once the beating heart of the Sumerian civilization, now crumbles under the weight of centuries. This story takes place in the year 2200 BC, during what the scribes call the time of great shadows, an era when the gods walked among us and fear loomed over the empire. Uruk, once glorious and protected by the towering walls built by the great king Gilgamesh, is now in decline. The markets, which once overflowed with gold, jewels, and spices from distant lands, now sell dry grains and lean goat meat. The temples are covered in dust, and prayers to the ancient gods, like Enlil, Lord of the Winds, sound empty and faint. The ziggurat, which was once the pride of the city, still dominates the skyline, but seems less imposing under the weight of time and abandonment. It was a time when ancient legends were spoken of. Legends of pacts with Sumerian gods like Enki, the wise and cunning god of the waters, and Anu, the sovereign of the heavens, but also legends of dark beings, such as Namta, the god of plague, and Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. These stories, told around campfires in the deserts, were not mere myths. They were warnings. I had been assigned to protect an archaeological expedition sent to the Temple of Enlil, located north of Uruk, in the arid desert lands. This temple, once the spiritual center of our empire, was now little more than ruins haunted by memories of sacrifices and abandoned prayers. The lead archaeologist, Nama, believed that somewhere deep within these ruins lay a relic, an artifact with powers beyond human comprehension. He was obsessed with what he called the Seal of Namta. Namta. The name alone sent shivers through anyone. According to the priests, Namta was the god who brought death and plague, the emissary of Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. It was said that his mere presence could cause armies to fall ill and entire cities to be consumed by disease. He was terror incarnate, a force no one wished to summon. When we arrived at the temple, I felt a heaviness in the air, as if the very earth was suffocated by something ancient and evil. The mud brick and stone walls were covered in carvings of bulls with hollow eyes, a symbol associated with Nergal, the god of war and destruction, one of the few who could oppose Namtar, though he did so with equally deadly fervor. On a worn stone altar in the center of the temple, there was a Sumerian inscription that Ur-Namma began to decipher. He grew pale as he realized what it said. "Here lies the seal that keeps Namtar imprisoned. No man shall disturb it." That was when Ur-Namma revealed the secret. The seal had been broken. Somehow, somewhere, something, or someone had awakened Namtar's power, and now he was free to walk the earth again. The whispers we heard in the ruins were not of this world. We were at the mercy of a god of pestilence. That night, as the cold desert winds howled through the stones, the camp was engulfed in a deadly silence. On the horizon, I saw a dark figure. Tall, cloaked in tattered robes, its eyes gleamed red beneath the hood. It was as if darkness itself bent to its will. I felt my blood freeze. I woke abruptly, in panic, and soon realized that one of our men, Ishtar, was sick. His body trembled uncontrollably, and black spots began spreading across his skin like a living plague. He coughed up blood, and within minutes, he was dead. On the floor of his tent, he had written in his own blood, "Do not look at him." Terror gripped us. Ur-Namma, desperate, began speaking of a ritual to seal Namtar once more. He believed that with the right blood and the ancient words, we could remake the pact that the kings of Uruk had forged millennia ago when they offered their souls to keep Namtar imprisoned deep beneath the earth. But what he didn't say, I knew. The ritual required sacrifice, and we were the sacrifice. In the hours that followed, the situation worsened. The wind howled fiercely, carrying the nauseating stench of rotting flesh. The shadows around us moved strangely, as if they had a life of their own. Every step we took seemed to draw us closer to eternal darkness. The stories of dark pacts with Namtar no longer seemed so distant. On the final night, as Ur-Namma prepared the sacred objects for the ritual, I saw him. The hooded figure was closer now, watching me from within the ruins. Its red eyes burned in the darkness. It was then that I realized the ritual would not be enough. The seal was broken, but restoring it would bring no peace. On the contrary, it would bring more destruction. Namtar could not be imprisoned again. He was a force that transcended the world of men and gods alike. In that final moment, I was faced with a choice: sacrifice my life in an attempt to perform the ritual, knowing it might be in vain, or flee, abandoning everyone to Namtar's wrath. The decision consumed me. I felt my courage slipping away, but at the same time, a paralyzing fear kept me from acting. Yet something within me, a sense of honor or perhaps pure madness, drove me to act. I approached the altar and, without hesitation, cut my arm, letting my blood flow onto the ancient stones. The Sumerian words spilled from Ur-Namma's lips in dark murmurs, and the wind around us roared with impossible fury. For a brief moment, I thought it might have worked. But I was wrong. My body began to petrify, as though the very earth was claiming me. I looked at my hands in horror, watching as my skin hardened and fused with the stones of the temple. My soul was being imprisoned. I would not die. I would become eternally part of the ruins, a cursed guardian, like the kings of Uruk who had sealed Namtar before me. Now, here I am, a living statue, a prisoner of this temple. Namtar has been contained, but not forever. He will return, and when he does, there will be no Naram-Sin to stop his wrath. I am Naram-Sin, the last guardian of Uruk, and this is my curse, and I'm still here.
On a winter twilight in 1582, my name was Malcolm Murray, one of the closest advisors to James IV. My role, they say, was to manage the kingdom's finances, ensuring the coffers of Edinburgh Castle remained full and that the king had everything he desired. But life at court wasn't just numbers and coins. It was the whisper of old legends echoing through the stone corridors, the shadows that danced along the walls, the oppressive weight of history. Edinburgh Castle was a sleeping giant haunted by memories that echoed through the windy nights. Stories told by soldiers and servants were enough to chill the blood. Prisoners who vanished, moans from the dungeons, ghosts of fallen warriors wandering in search of justice. There was something more, a shadow that seemed to stretch into every corner of the castle, something unseen but felt deep within the soul. One night, the king summoned me in secret. "Malcolm," he whispered, "I have seen something." His eyes were dim, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He spoke of a spirit that visited him at night, a female figure dressed in rags, her skin pale and eyes empty. He knew, as did I, the tales of the White Lady, a specter wandering the halls, eternally trapped in mourning over her execution hundreds of years ago within those very walls. And yet, there was something more in James's eyes, something that hinted this was no ordinary legend. I assured him I would investigate thoroughly, although in my heart, a sense of unease was already growing. The first presentiment occurred as I descended into the crypts, where an unnatural chill enveloped me, as if the air itself refused to touch my skin. There I found an old manuscript abandoned, its pages yellowed by time. As I opened it, a single word seemed to pulse in red: Decade, Gaelic for seek or follow. My fingers trembled as I touched the page, and for a moment I saw, oh God, I saw the figure of the king himself reflected in a puddle of water that didn't exist, with his eyes gouged out and mouth agape in an eternal scream. In the following days, I dedicated myself to further investigation. The reports were numerous but vague. They said the White Lady was merely a shadow of a greater horror, something dating back to ancient times when pagan rituals were performed on the castle stones to appease a hungry entity. The more I read, the more I felt that this story was far more than a mere legend. Something was awakening, something that craved blood, that demanded sacrifice. The second presentiment came during a morning walk through Edinburgh's markets. I was distracted, lost in my thoughts, when a gypsy approached me. She looked directly into my eyes and said, "The moon will reflect your soul, counselor, and when you see your face in the darkness, it will be too late." Her tone was serious, threatening. Those words stayed with me, crawling through my mind like serpents in the dark. The final night arrived. The king summoned me once more, pale as death, and spoke of what he had seen. She was there, Malcolm, inside the mirror. She showed me my future. James was trembling, sweat dripping down his forehead. Cautiously, I asked him to take me to the mirror. It was an ancient artifact, kept in the deepest part of the castle, where the air seemed heavier. The moment I entered the room, a chill ran down my spine. The walls seemed to vibrate, pulsing with some strange energy. When I looked into the mirror, I felt my heart stop for a second. There was no reflection, only emptiness. And then I saw a movement behind me. Oh no! I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The king stood pale, his eyes fixed on the mirror. And then she appeared, the White Lady. Not as an ethereal ghost, but as flesh and blood, her face twisted into a mask of agony. She looked at me, her hollow eyes burning into my soul, and whispered, "The cycle must be completed." The door behind us slammed shut, locking us inside. The king tried to run, but I was paralyzed, hypnotized by the figure that now approached us. She didn't walk, no. She floated, as if the ground was unworthy of her touch. When she reached out to the mirror, its liquid surface turned to blood, dripping down the walls. The truth then hit me like a cold blade. I was next. I was to be the sacrifice. The manuscript, the warnings, the gypsy's words, they all pointed to this moment. No, I screamed, trying to open the door, but it was useless. James began muttering prayers, but his words were incoherent, fragmented. Despair swallowed us whole. The lady approached and touched my forehead. All of a sudden, I felt the weight of the castle's entire history. Every soul, every death, every drop of blood spilled. She didn't just want my body. She wanted my essence, my very existence, to feed her eternal torment. A voice whispered in my mind. It wasn't the lady's voice, it was my own. You always knew, Malcolm. You always knew this moment would come. And in a flash, I realized that I had made a pact long before becoming her advisor. I was the one responsible for the curse, for that entity's hunger centuries ago. And this was my end, a death destined since the dawn of time. Without warning, the mirror cracked, and on the other side I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. It was the king, with the same terrified gaze, and in his face I saw the smile of the white lady. She was me. I was her, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and madness. In the final moment, as the mirror shattered, I was pulled into it. The world around me dissolved into darkness and cold, and all that remained was the sound of my own screams echoing in the depths of Edinburgh Castle. I never left that place, never, and I'm sure I shall not.
I was known as Altan, Genghis Khan's right hand, a man he trusted in his campaigns. Our mission took us to what we now call Karakoto, a distant city on the banks of the Ijin River, where the wind sang with the tone of 1,000 forgotten voices. It was said that the city held an ancient power, a force that not even the great Khan would dare awaken. But he never listened to such superstitions. The desire for conquest was always stronger than any legend. That night, one of the local elders warned us about the Harahesar, the Black Wind, an entity that he claimed spared no arrogance from invaders. We laughed at his warning, and Genghis ordered us to proceed. I feared no wind, he declared, his deep voice echoing across the dunes. Not even one that speaks the language of the dead. And so we crossed the city gates, feeling the whispers of an unseen storm in the distance. My horse, Bayan, my most loyal companion since the Mongolian steppes, was restless, which was unusual for him. Bayan was never afraid. In Mongol culture, a horse is more than an animal. It's an extension of one's spirit. I could feel his fear, the rising panic in his heart. Something isn't right. I whispered to him, stroking his mane, trying to calm him. That night, it all began. Shadows around our camp seemed to stretch, taking on forms that didn't belong to this world. Forgotten temples rose in the distance, and a soft melody, like the murmur of the wind, invaded our dreams. My comrades began to disappear, one by one. First, it was Tamar, the swordsman. He was found the next morning, eyes glazed and skin cold, his body twisted as if something had drained the very essence of his life. The marks left on his neck, thin as strands of silk, resembled a hungry serpent. On the second day, I heard the warriors whispering about the Harahesar. I saw the fear in them, but I stayed firm. At dusk, I felt the wind brush my face, cold as the northern ice. And then I heard it. It was as if something whispered my name, coming from a distance not measured in steps, but in centuries. When I opened my eyes, I saw Bayan, his eyes as large as the moon, reflecting the emptiness of the night. He refused to move forward. That's when I realized we were surrounded by indistinct figures, their outlines shifting like mist in the moonlight. Their faces, like Tengri, their faces. They had no eyes, only deep shadows that seemed to pull me inside. Go, I shouted to Bayan, and he neighed but stood by my side. Bravery. He had more courage than many men. As I stood, I heard the sound of drums, but these weren't war drums. No, they were the beats of a heart that thrashed against its ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. And then I knew somehow that it wasn't my heart. It was the heart of the city. That same night, my friend Badar vanished. All that remained was his helmet, still slowly spinning in the sand, as if left there by invisible hands. Something was toying with us, like a cat with a mouse before delivering the final blow. It was in the early hours of the third day that I discovered the secret. The city wasn't just cursed. It was a sepulchre, a prison made of stone and sand, built to keep something locked away. A power that should never have been unleashed. In the central temple, amidst the ruins, I found an altar and atop it, a wolf's pelt. I tried to approach, but the wind, that same wind that tormented us, gained form and substance, rising like a wall, whispering in a language that only shadows could understand. And then I saw him, the Khan. He stood there staring at me, but his eyes were empty, devoid of the light I had always taken as certainty. And suddenly, he turned and pointed to the horizon. "No, Alton, there's nothing left for us here, only ashes." That's when I understood. The city didn't want to be conquered. It wanted to consume. I understood, but it was too late. The men who had joined us were being pulled into the ground, as if the shadows themselves were swallowing them. I tried to run, but felt a cold hand grasp my ankle. It was Beitar, or what was left of him. His mouth moved, forming words that made no sound. Oh, the gods had abandoned us. With a final effort, Bayan pulled me up, as if he knew it was our only chance. We rode as if hell itself was at our heels, and perhaps it was. The wind, that cursed wind, kept whispering, kept following, like a predator chasing its prey. Finally, when we were a safe distance away, I looked back. Karakoto was just a shadow on the horizon, but the voices never stopped. I can still hear them. And then I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Bayan was limping, and when I looked at his leg, I saw marks that looked like fingers, hands that had tried to drag him into that abyss. And when I looked into his eyes, I no longer saw my faithful companion. Oh, Bayan, you heard it too, didn't you? You heard the whispers as well. And here I am now, far from Karakoto, but never far enough. The wind still follows me, its whisper now clearer, calling my name, asking me to return. Because something slipped away that day. Something I left behind, something the black wind still wants. Or did it never leave me at all?